why was Yeshua, a.k.a. Jesus, executed? For claiming to be the Messiah? For claiming to be God? Who was responsible, and why should we care? A common response from the Christian religious community is that he was betrayed to the Romans by the Jewish religious authorities for having made blasphemous assertions about his own personhood. After all, didn't he claim that he was the Messiah? Didn't he claim to be God? Well, such questions open a huge scholarly can of worms, since a good deal of modern textual scholarship correctly notes that the Christian Gospels, as we have them today, were composed long after the fact, even decades after the life of Yeshua himself. There's no question that they were edited by later scribal hands, which in turn were influenced by a strong religious agenda to evaluate and to elevate Yeshua, even to divine status. That said, looking at the text as we have it, it's clear that the term Son of God was something that others said about Yeshua. It wasn't something that Yeshua said about himself, but he did often refer to himself as the Son of Man. And many have tried to find the parallel here with the prophet Ezekiel, who was repeatedly called Son of Dust, Ben Adam in Hebrew. In this case, Jesus would be speaking with great humility. But another view sees a reference here to the book of Daniel, in which there's a vision of one like a Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven as a judge at the end of days. This section of Daniel is in Aramaic, and the term is Bar Enosh. While the Gospels came down to us in Greek, if Jesus actually employed this Aramaic term when he spoke, he would have been making a bold, even audacious claim about his identity, the very opposite of humility. Did Yeshua ever point blank say that he was the Messiah? Not exactly. Others made the claim about him. Even when he famously asked, "Who do men say that I am?" he let others, in this case his disciple Peter, draw their own conclusions. Even though he commended Peter in the text as we have it, this is hardly enough evidence to prove that he himself made messianic claims. And even if he linked himself to the end-time Son of Man in the book of Daniel, there's no indication that he made a personal claim to divinity, certainly not in the Christian Trinitarian sense. There is, of course, John's Gospel, in which Jesus is said to have remarked, "I and the Father are one. And before Abraham was, I am." But as we've already noticed, John is considered a separate case by textual scholars and employs very different language than Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Even though it rails against Gnosticism, it's the most Gnostic of Christian texts and the least likely to convey the actual words of the historical Jesus. Even taking it at face value, such language links Yeshua with the pre-existent Logos and doesn't necessarily make him the same as God or identical with God. All of this should help us when it comes to the trial of Yeshua before Pontius Pilate. The charge of blasphemy, present in both Mark's and Matthew's Gospel, is notably absent in Luke's. In fact, the whole idea that the Pharisees were involved in a conspiracy against Yeshua appears by many scholars to have been an editorial addition to the text, again found in Mark 3:6 and Matthew 12:14, but not in Luke. This is critical to understand because a great deal of the anti-Semitism of the centuries to follow came about as a result of the claim that the Jewish religious leaders, specifically the Pharisees, were responsible for the crucifixion. And as we know, the Pharisees were the direct forebears of the sages and rabbis of the Jewish people for centuries to come and down to the present day. The attempt to damn the Pharisees amounts to an attempt to damn the entire Jewish faith. And what does that suggest about those who practice that faith even today? The value of scholarship is to show the baselessness of all this. In fact, if anyone was on Yeshua's side, it was the Pharisees. Yeshua's famous disciple, Nicodemus, was a Pharisee. And it was another Pharisee, Joseph of Arimathea, who lent Yeshua his own tomb for a proper burial. So what really happened at the trial of Yeshua? Let's take it step by step. First, we're told that Yeshua was somehow aware of his imminent arrest. He gathered his disciples for one final meal. But was it a Passover meal? A Seder? Except we're told that it transpired not on the eve of Passover, but the previous day, since Yeshua was crucified on the eve of Passover, in which case it couldn't have been a Passover Seder. After the meal, Yeshua retired to the Mount of Olives, where he was approached by his disciple Judas in the company of Roman soldiers, who proceeded to betray him with a kiss. Why was he being arrested? For blasphemy? Hardly. For his assault on the money changers at the temple? Because the Sadducees felt threatened by his growing popularity? Or simply because his actions as a healer and miracle worker elsewhere in the city stirred up crowds and put fear into the hearts of the authorities? These are all open questions. Next, we're told that Yeshua is brought before the high priest Caiaphas. Caiaphas hears witnesses, one of whom reports Yeshua as saying, "I will destroy this temple." But the evidence is seen to be unclear. It is Caiaphas who asks Yeshua whether he is the Messiah.
Are you not going to answer? What is this testimony that these men are bringing against you? I charge you under oath by the living God. Tell us if you are the Mashiach, the Son of God.
The text has Yeshua confirm this, replying, "You have said so." But he never uses these exact terms about himself. Again, he refers to himself as the Son of Man, who will come with clouds of heaven. Caiaphas is said to have torn his garment as an expression of grief over this perceived blasphemy.
He has spoken blasphemy. Why do we need any more witnesses? Look, now you have heard the blasphemy. What do you think?
It is decided that the Galilean prophet is worthy of death. Next, we're told that Yeshua is brought before the Sanhedrin. But this is also problematical, since it's doubtful that the Sanhedrin would meet at night and immediately before the Passover holiday. Perhaps this was just an ad hoc assembly of select members of the Sanhedrin. Yet another issue for us to wrap our brains about. For its part, the Sanhedrin certainly had the power to execute criminals, but it had no jurisdiction on matters of sedition or insurrection. That's why Yeshua is sent on to the Roman prefect, Pontius Pilate. It's often asserted that it was Pilate, the Roman prefect, who was alone responsible for Yeshua's execution, and that the gospel narratives falsely displace the blame on the multitude of Jews shouting, "Crucify him!" But it's nonetheless been argued that Pilate well understood that Yeshua, as a Hasid, let's call him, was no particular threat to Roman authority. In other words, he knew that the charge of sedition was baseless. Consequently, it's argued, the Gospels are right in asserting that Pilate wanted to let him go. Still, I might argue that a much more nuanced approach might be in order. For one thing, it's difficult to imagine that Yeshua, as a pious Galilean, didn't have some considerable sense of sympathy for the zealot faction. And with regard to the geographical locale identified with Yeshua, it's undeniable that the Galilee was the locus of resistance to Roman hegemony over the land of Israel. The great Jewish scholar Heinrich Graetz, for example, classically declared that the greater parts of the populace were zealots. Add to this the detail that at least one of Yeshua's disciples carried a sword in Luke 22:36-38. And we have a considerably less than pacifistic Jesus, all things considered. Pilate, however, had neither the inclination nor the manpower to execute the entire population of Galilee. Yeshua's offense was against the Sadducees, and to some extent the temple, as evidenced by his act of overturning the tables of the money changers. This by itself didn't make him a zealot, and hardly amounted to an offense against Rome or Roman rule. Moreover, Yeshua's connection with the Hasidim would have been of no interest to Pilate. Could well be that while the Hasidim of this period, including Yeshua, were, like their Maccabean forebears, and like the Essenes, capable of violent militarism, this wouldn't have been readily apparent to an outside observer, including a Roman procurator. It could also be that when the Gospels record Pilate's original intention to release Yeshua, they are quite correct. Why then did Pilate sentence Yeshua to be crucified? Valuable insight is at this point gained from the late David Flusser of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, who analyzed Pilate's character as a mixture of cruelty and cowardice. And this is evidenced by an incident at Caesarea recorded by Josephus, in which a delegation of Jews from Jerusalem demanded the removal of offending Roman military standards deemed to be idolatrous. Let's have Pilate explain it himself.
On one occasion, when the soldiers under my command came to Jerusalem, I ordered them to bring their standards with them, upon which were the usual images of the emperor. The standards were brought in secretly by night, but their presence was soon discovered. Immediately, multitudes of excited Jews hastened to Caesarea to petition me for the removal of the obnoxious standards. For 5 days, I refused to hear them. But on the 6th, I took my place on the judgment seat. And when the Jews were admitted, I had them surrounded with soldiers and threatened them with instant death unless they ceased to trouble me with the matter. The Jews thereupon flung themselves on the ground and bared their necks, declaring that they preferred death to the violation of their laws. Unwilling to slay so many, I yielded the point and removed the standards.
This single incident reveals the extent to which the prefect was capable of being swayed by a determined crowd. This was the cowardly element in his personality, which Flusser references in order to support the notion advanced by the Gospels that Pilate was cowed by a Sadducee-dominated crowd to have Yeshua executed, when his own better judgment would have considered him only as a charismatic preacher prophet who perhaps deserved a lashing but nothing more. Those who see Yeshua's crucifixion as clear evidence that he was a zealot insurrectionist had better rethink their position. But neither should we misconstrue Flusser's argument as proof that Yeshua was unfriendly to the zealot cause. And the mere suspicion that a Galilean prophet might have offered aid and comfort to the insurrectionists might have so inflamed the Sadducean priesthood, themselves in league with the Roman-dominated status quo, that they stirred up a crowd of their own sympathizers and coerced Pilate into ordering the crucifixion. But the bottom line is this: the Jewish people as a whole were not responsible for the death of Yeshua, nor did they sympathize with his crucifixion. Either Pilate had him executed against the wishes of the people, or it was the Sadducees, not the Pharisees, and not the rank and file of the populace, who prevailed upon Pilate to release the troublemaker known as Barabbas and have Yeshua crucified instead. Either way, the charge that the Jews rejected Jesus and then conspired to kill him is perhaps the worst slander ever perpetrated in all the annals of human history. For the charge Christ killers was repeated across Christian Europe for the next 2 millennia, even to the present day. The results were endless anti-Semitic attacks, the Crusades, the bubonic plague, blamed of course on Jews, waves of expulsion and exile, the Spanish Inquisition, and many more outrages. In fact, the Nazi Holocaust could not have occurred had it not been for this legacy of shame, directly linked to the trial and crucifixion of Jesus as described in the New Testament. It's the work of serious scholarship that can shed new light on the most troublesome of texts and help bring about not just a new level of understanding, but a new dynamic of interfaith reconciliation. And that makes it all worthwhile.